Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the third and last part of the online training course about data collection for mobility management. Last time we discussed the design for the survey, and now we want to discuss the implementation itself and the data processing and analyzing afterwards, and also some thoughts about data storage. And again, we have to discuss a little bit about GDPR issues. So the first step, what you need to do is to develop the database, what you can develop already in parallel before you start to launch the survey. Ideally, you create names for variables, they are self-explaining. Meanwhile, we have no storage problem to shorten or abbreviate the variables. So best you use just gender for gender, age for age, and so far, instead of Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, because if some other person is opening the database, he will struggling on that coding maybe, or even yourself. If you open it as some years later, you will be happy to find a self-explaining variable names. As for the coding, usually the values you enter in the database, or it's created by the software tool, usually it's good and advisable to avoid zero values, that you will not mix it up with empty cells with no answers. So for example, if you have a no or yes question, then you can code no with 1 and yes with 2 and not with 0 and 1, for example, so that you always are aware of missing entries or values 0. Of course, there's some exemption because sometimes the value could be really 0, for example, like the temperature or something like this, but usually try to avoid to have 0 as a code if you have free of choice to code it. Of course, you have also to define and document the units of the variables. If you have the values in the database that you're sure, if for example for distance, if it's kilometers or meters or miles or whatever in your database, that you understand it very soon, what you can read here. And of course, you can also define ranges of values. For example, if you ask employees, you can set the range for an age from 15 to 75. What is the legal situation in your country? Then you can already avoid when there is some wrong entries in your database, it will be detected immediately. Or for example, you have a range of a scale from 1 to 10, you can already define this variable from these values. Always try to have just one line or one column, if you prefer, per individual respondent. This is important that if you want to analyze it, then you can have run into problems if you have a more complex database. Of course, it could happen that you have, for example, a person database and you ask the person for their trips, and of course one person can have more trips than one. Then you create another database for the trips, and of course you need to link them with an ID from the person to the trip database, that you can see which trips are connected with which person. For example, these key variables. Usually you define a random number for that, because not use the names of the persons or other identifiable variables or information, because we will come later to that GDPR issues. You should delete it after all. Define and document variables you may add to the database from external sources, or you can calculate something. For example, if you ask for the starting time and ending time, you can calculate the duration of a trip, for example, and you can also add this. Maybe you can also highlight which are original data by the respondents and which are derived data. You can use a color code, for example. This could also help to understand the database later on. Or of course you can also add some information, like for example weather information, what was the temperature when the trip was carried out. You do not need to ask them if you have a database available where you can get this data from. And it's also advisable to create a separate database about the meta information of your survey. So for there you have all your list, all your persons you will contact, for example, and the status of this person. So if they already been contacted and invited to fill in the form, or did they already reply and filled in the form? So is the case already completed? Or is it somewhere in between? Do you need to send out a reminder for this person, for example? And this is always advisable to have a database to have for the management and the controlling of the survey itself, especially if it's a bigger survey. If you're running the survey, of course, you need to calculate, to estimate the resources you need, the labor resources, and of course then for the budget. And if you have personal telephone interviews or interviews at site, it's of course not only the time of this interview itself what you have to calculate, but you have another aspect during the survey which needs some time and labor resources. Briefly here you see this in the bullet points. So the first of all, if you do it not yourself, so you have some interviewers you recruit, then you need to brief them, to train them what's about the interview, what's the intention of the question, because maybe the respondents will ask them and they should be here fully briefed to be able to answer these potential questions. Then of course it's not always the case that in the first attempt to get the contact to the respondents. So for example in the telephone interviews you have to phone more than once to get a line with a contact line with the respondent. This is also time consuming process and you have to consider that. Then of course the interview itself, how long takes the interview. Usually you can do this by testing and estimate this very good. And then also consider some post-processing process of the interview. So you need the interviewer add some information in the database after the interview to complete it or upload it to a server or whatever. If it's of course on-site, also you have to consider that the interviewer has to arrive and depart from the interview site, so you have some travel time also to include, and those advisable to include some feedback rounds with the interviewers after the interview to have some options to get feedback from the interviewers, some lessons learned, what could be improved for a potential next survey. In parallel, you also have to initiate some accompanying activities before and during the survey. Especially in the start phase, you have to be available for the interviewers if there are some troubles, some questions arising that were not included in the briefing, that you can answer them. That's very important in the initial phase of the interview period. And in parallel, you have to announce the survey as most as possible, that everyone is aware of the survey. So for example, try to get in contact with the responsible for the company newsletter, or maybe there's some info screens in your company where you can advertise this survey. And of course you can also try to get some support from trustful persons. They are supporting this. Maybe they give their names as testimonial for the survey, those like team leaders or CEOs or whatever. And this is also an important point, even if they are not willing to support it directly, but they should be at least informed about the survey, because it's very likely that, for example, if you send out emails invitation for a survey, maybe potential respondents will get in contact with their team leader or some other colleagues or some leading persons in the company asking about the survey, and if they're not aware of this survey, then they are skeptical and will not respond likely. Of course, if you send out and you have the chance to get in contact with your respondents, use this. So you can check who is not responding so far, send out reminders, and motivate the person to respond with some arguments in the text and the emails, for example, that we really need this information that we can design a good mobility management in the company, for example, so that there is some positive some positive influence if you fill in this survey. The next step then is the recruitment strategy. We have to distinguish between if you have a register available where you can use this for the sampling, and based on your estimated response rate, so from how many person you contact, how many will reply. Typical response rate is maybe 20%, for example, from our experience. You can calculate the gross sample, so how many people you have to contact that you get enough persons at the end as your net sample for your analysis. Then you can, when you know this number and you know the number of the register, you can then pick the random sample out of the register, for example, to use every fifth entry to select and to send out the invitation to this person from the register. And of course, not only start with the first entry, also to give a random number for the line where you start your selection procedure, for example, somewhere in the middle, 152. You can generate such random figures on Excel, for example. If you are sampling at site, so if you make face-to-face interview at a specific site, also here try to randomize the recruitment in the meaning that you use maybe different places to get different people of the company to include in your interview, also different day times during your survey, and also the selection procedure itself, especially if you do not run just the interviews yourself, but you pass this to some interviewers. Also, you define a procedure how to select it, because if you do not give any advices on this, there will be a bias on female respondents, middle age. This is the typical situation when the interviewer can select her or his own respondents. So, for example, you can say there is a specific gate, and every fifth person who is entering the gate you have to contact, and then again every fifth person if you are ready for a new interview. What is also important, also then you document all this information you gathered after the survey, for example, the gross sample, how large it was, how large was the net sample, to calculate the response rate, to have this information at hand if you're interested, and how many invitations, for example, have you sent out, how much was the time, for example, consumption really to get the one interviews based on your time effort, including all these management tasks and issues, for example. Also to get a good idea of the costs per interview sample. And after the data entry, you first check the entries. You can analyze the unit non-response, so if there are any empty lines in your database. This occurs, for example, if you use online surveys. In the online surveys, if one is opening the survey but did not start to fill in data, it already created a line. So you have to delete all these lines. They are empty because they are not valid, of course, for your analysis. And also it could happen that we have item non-response, so that someone is filling the questionnaire, but on some questions he did not give any answer as he didn't want to say, or he didn't know about it. For example, that you can also analyze if there is a specific question where the rate of item non-response is relatively high, that you're aware of, there could be a problem in this question. Then it's always wise to make some plausibility checks. So for example, if the results, descriptive results of the survey is surprising. Maybe the question was misunderstood. Or even you can do some plausibility checks. For example, if a walking speed is too high, when you calculate the time of the trip and the length of the trip, so the speed is, I don't know, 40 kilometers per hour, then maybe there is an error in the database. Or the same, for example, if a car driver, a person states he drove a car, but he stated that he has no driving license, for example, in the sociodemographic data. And also, is the value itself plausible? For example, is it in the range of the expected values? What you can also do then for every variable to calculate the random error, so how accurate is the data of each individual value. If you're analyzing the data, the raw data, for example, then of course you can only understood what the respondents react on that. So this is not the information of the whole population, because you have to consider maybe there's a bias in the data. Only a specific group have answered with different attitudes or different behavior, for example. So if you want to analyze the whole population, you need to project it to the whole population, including some weighting procedure. For example, if you have too many females in your net sample and you have to rebalance these values again, the statements of the females according to the share of the males, for example. But for this, of course, you need the truth of your registers, so you can only weight, of course, things where you know the split between males and females of the total population, for example, of your employees. If you want to understand differences between groups, or for example, if you want to understand difference of statements between females and males on specific question or behavior, there are some tests that you can also carry out. Not in this course, I can go into such detail, but I recommend to Google for t-test or chi-square test. This is the typical statistical test. If you can see if differences between statements are significant. So if, for example, the female population of a sample has a clear different meaning or rating on a specific question than males, for example, or car users and cyclists. What also need to be done in the data analyzing is the open answers to be analyzed and categorized, to group this in type of answers that you can really analyze this data. This also concerns if you have this category others, if you have some question with categories and you have this included as others. Also you read the entries on the others data, and sometimes you can categorize this to the pre-categorized answers. Like for example, he said only a company name and it's a taxi, and you can reorganize this data for example mode of taxi. This is of course possible. If there are other open answers, you can also cluster these to a new category if another is occurring very often, and if not, you can just leave it as the category others, of course. If you then develop some descriptive graphs of specific questions or behavior, always include in the graph or very close nearby the information about this graph. So what is the graph about? For example, the date of the survey, so which year this survey was carried out, what was the specific question, what are the potential categories of answers, what was the net sample of these categories. So the net sample could be then different between different questions, because not all questions may be answered by all your respondents. Think on that. The target population, so who were asked, was it the employees of the people, was it the citizens, or was it just the bicycle users of a subgroup, what you can see on the graph. This should be of course explained in the graph, otherwise maybe other people who are trying to interpret these graphs could be confused. And the final step is the data storage and documentation, because think on maybe you can use this data also to compare it on the time series. Maybe you make the same or similar survey some years later on. You can compare the data, for example, or you just want to know something and you will go into data again. So you need to storage and document it that you will find this information. But in principle, as soon as you not longer needed to delete all this individual identification, like name or address or residences in the raw data, because it's an issue of the GDPR aspect again. But of course you have to think on if it's really possible to delete the whole raw data, because sometimes you are want to store it, but ideally in an anonymized form, because we already discussed this in the second part of this online training tool, that as soon as you can identify specific persons in your database, and this one will ask for deletion or ask for information what is stored about him, he has the right to do so, and you have to fulfill this. So it creates work as soon as you can still identify specific persons. And if you document the data and store it, you have to have some meta information in this database to be included in a text format, maybe somewhere in the description, just alongside with the database, like the date and the description of the survey, the goal of the survey method, how you carried out the survey, which was the target population, which is maybe the responsible contact person for the survey. If someone maybe has a question on that he gets the right person who can answer this. How was the sampling and the recruitment procedure? Maybe to include the list of the questions and answer categories. So best to have a copy of the survey itself, some screenshots or scans. Explanation of the variables, units and codes, that you can understand again the data even some years later. Where is the data stored and also who is allowed to use it. And some further comments like lessons learned, what can't you do better for the next survey. So that was the 3 parts of data collection for mobility management. I hope you have enjoyed these presentations and you learned some things. If you want to carry out the data collection for mobility management on your own. And I'm happy that you have listened to me, and thanks for that, and have good luck with your own data collection in the near future. Thank you.